The rejection. Daniel Carter stepped off the stagecoach with his suitcase clutched tightly, a fragile bundle of hope wrapped in worn leather. The town of Fairbrook lay before him, modest yet bustling, its wooden storefronts lined like sentinels beneath the pale morning sun. He had traveled far on borrowed courage, leaving behind the bleak boarding house where no one waited for him, believing the promise of a new wife and a new life was worth every mile. He spotted her at once. Clara Whitfield stood tall, near the carriage yard, black silk rustling in the wind, her chin lifted with the authority of someone accustomed to command. A widow of wealth, she was known by reputation even to a stranger like Daniel. For months, she had written letters, painting pictures of companionship, of respect, of a man's place beside her. He had clung to those words like a starving man clings to bread. With nervous precision, he smoothed his thin coat and crossed the street. "Mrs. Whitfield?" His voice was steady, though his heart thrummed like a drum. Clara's gaze swept him from head to toe. Her eyes, cold as polished steel, hardened instantly. "You're Daniel Carter?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, forcing a smile. "I've come as agreed." She did not return the smile. Instead, her lips curled, not in warmth but in contempt. "You're far too skinny." The words dropped into the silence of the street like stones into water. Daniel felt heat crawl up his neck as two men outside the saloon snickered. He shifted under the weight of her disapproval, wishing his narrow shoulders could bear the burden of her expectations. "I may not be broad," he said, summoning dignity, "but I am hard-working. Clara lifted a gloved hand, silencing him. "I cannot present you as my husband. People would laugh at me. I required strength, presence, a man to match the memory of my Edward. Instead, they have sent me a boy." Daniel's chest tightened. He had endured insults before, but never one that stripped him so nakedly in public. Around them, townsfolk lingered, pretending not to listen while drinking in every word. Clara turned to her carriage, dismissing him without ceremony. "Return to where you came from. I will not be mocked." The driver snapped the reins, and she was gone, leaving only dust in her wake. Daniel stood rooted, suitcase heavy at his side, humiliation heavier still. He had imagined many outcomes for this day, but none so cruel, none so final. The future he had carried in his mind, shared meals, quiet laughter, a place to belong, collapsed with a single sentence. As he gathered the remnants of his pride, he noticed a figure across the street. A woman, plainly dressed, her brown hair tied neatly back, lingered near the door of a feed store. Unlike the others who looked away, Evelyn Morris met his eyes. There was no mockery in her gaze, only a flicker of sympathy, as though she recognized the sting of rejection. He dipped his head in acknowledgement, grateful though words failed him. Yet before she could step closer, the sound of another stagecoach whistle cut the air, and Daniel turned away, unwilling to let more strangers witness his shame. That evening, he rented the cheapest room above the saloon. The walls smelled of smoke and spilled ale. The bed sagged beneath his weary frame, but it offered solitude. He sat in the dim light, Clara's words repeating with merciless clarity. Too skinny, too weak, not enough. He pressed his palms against his knees, steadying his breath. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps no woman wanted a man like him. Yet beneath the ache, a spark of defiance stirred. He had crossed states with nothing but determination. He would not let a single cruel judgment define his worth. Still, as he lay down on the creaking bed, loneliness settled over him like a shroud. He did not know that the plain widow who had met his eyes with unexpected kindness would soon alter the course of his life, nor that betrayal and love would entwine his fate in ways he could not yet imagine. For now, he closed his eyes with shame as his companion, unaware that this rejection was not the end of his story, but its beginning. A widow's kindness. The next morning, Daniel rose from the saloon's narrow bed with a weight pressing on his chest. Clara's rejection still rang in his ears, each word a brand he could not shake. He considered leaving Fairbrook altogether, but leaving meant returning to nothing. He had no home waiting, no family to welcome him back. To turn away now was to admit defeat, and though his frame was lean, his spirit had endured too much to surrender so easily. When he stepped into the street, the town moved briskly around him. Merchants called out prices, horses clattered over cobblestones, and children tugged at their mothers' skirts. Among them, Daniel felt like a ghost, present, yet unseen. Except by one. "Mr. Carter?" The voice was soft but steady. He turned to find Evelyn Morris standing with a small basket hooked over her arm. Up close, he noticed the wear in her hands, the faint lines etched by grief around her eyes. Yet there was strength in her posture, the kind that came not from wealth but from survival. He tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am. I saw what happened yesterday," she said gently. "It wasn't right what she did. No one deserves to be shamed like that." Daniel swallowed against the lump in his throat. "I suppose I wasn't what she wanted." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then offered a faint smile. "Sometimes people don't know what they need until it's gone. If you've nowhere to go, I have a spare room in my house. It isn't much, but you'd be welcome." Her offer startled him. Charity often carried hidden barbs, yet her eyes held no pity, only sincerity. He hesitated, pride urging him to refuse, but practicality spoke louder. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Morris. I wouldn't wish to trouble you." "It's no trouble," she replied. "My land could use a man's help. You be earning your keep." And so, Daniel followed her to a modest homestead on the outskirts of town. The farmhouse bore the marks of hard years. Paint faded, shutters loose, but it was tidy, with a small garden pushing stubbornly through the soil. Inside, the room smelled faintly of bread and lavender. It was no mansion like Clara's, but to Daniel, it felt more like home than any place in years. In the days that followed, he threw himself into labor. He mended fences, carried water, and repaired a sagging roof beam. His thin frame masked a reservoir of endurance. He worked without complaint, determined to prove his worth. Evelyn watched quietly, noting the care with which he moved through her world, never asking for more than she offered. Still, not all eyes on her land were kind. One afternoon, while Daniel was chopping wood, Nate, a broad-shouldered farmhand from a neighboring property, leaned against the fence with an easy grin. He had been calling on Evelyn since her husband's death, offering both help and companionship. His visits carried a charm that stirred whispers in town. "You've taken in quite the stray," Nate remarked, nodding toward Daniel. "Doesn't look like he could wrestle a calf, let alone manage a farm." Evelyn stiffened, sensing the challenge beneath his casual tone. "He does what needs doing," she replied evenly. Nate's grin widened. "I suppose. But a woman like you deserves more than scraps. You deserve strength, protection." His gaze lingered too long, and though his words carried flattery, there was an edge of possession in them. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, torn between the easy allure Nate represented and the quiet steadiness Daniel brought. Desire was a dangerous thing, and loneliness had left her vulnerable. She dismissed Nate quickly, yet his presence lingered in her thoughts like smoke that refused to clear. That evening, Daniel carried in the last bucket of water, his hands raw from labor. Evelyn watched him set it down, his movements efficient despite his weariness. He looked up, and for a moment their eyes locked. She saw not weakness, but patience, loyalty, and a kind of dignity that no broad shoulders could guarantee. Still, as she prepared supper, Evelyn's mind drifted to Nate's words. Protection, strength. She had known both in her late husband, and losing them had left a hollow ache. Now, two men stood in her orbit, one promising desire, the other offering steadfastness. Her heart, unsteady and uncertain, trembled between them. Daniel, unaware of the storm in her chest, simply said, "Thank you for giving me a place here. I won't forget it." His sincerity struck deeper than he could know. Evelyn forced a smile, but long after Daniel retired to his room, she sat by the fire with restless hands. Temptation whispered of paths she should not walk, and the faint warmth of Daniel's presence reminded her of the path she might yet choose. The night closed around the farmhouse, quiet but heavy with unspoken questions. And in that silence, the seeds of conflict began to take root. The fracture, The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Daniel worked from dawn until dusk, repairing Evelyn's fences, hauling wood, and tending her modest garden. His lean frame carried a surprising resilience, and though sweat often soaked his shirt, he never complained. Evelyn found herself watching him more than she cared to admit. There was a quiet nobility in the way he shouldered burdens without seeking praise. Yet loneliness is a cunning enemy, and Evelyn's heart was not immune to its whispers. One afternoon, while Daniel rode into town for supplies, Nate appeared at her door. His grin was confident, his stance broad, as though he owned the space simply by standing in it. "You shouldn't be working so hard, Evelyn," he said, taking the basket from her hands without asking. "A woman like you deserves ease." "I manage well enough," she replied, though her voice softened despite herself. Nate had a way of making her feel noticed, desired, as though she were more than just a widow clinging to scraps of dignity. He leaned closer, his tone dropping. "You don't have to be alone." The words struck her where she was weakest. She should have sent him away. She knew it, but when his hand brushed hers, warmth shot through her chest, a reminder of passion she thought had died with her husband. Against her better judgment, she allowed him to steal a kiss. It was brief, reckless, and wrong, yet awakened a hunger she struggled to deny. When Daniel returned, he found Evelyn pale and distracted. She busied herself with supper, avoiding his steady gaze. He sensed the distance, but said nothing, attributing it to fatigue. His trust was as natural as his labor, unquestioning, and she hated herself for betraying it. Still, Nate did not disappear. He lingered at her fences, offered to help in the barn, whispered words that stirred her even as guilt gnawed at her. The town began to notice his frequent visits, tongues wagging in the merciless way small towns do. One evening, Daniel carried in a sack of grain and froze at the sight before him. Through the open doorway, he saw Evelyn standing close to Nate, her head bowed as his hand lingered on her arm. It was not an embrace, but it was intimacy enough to make Daniel's chest tighten. He stepped forward, the sack slipping from his grip. The grain spilled across the floor, scattering like the fragments of his trust. Both Evelyn and Nate turned, startled. "I should go," Nate muttered, slipping past Daniel with an arrogance that made the wound deeper. Silence filled the room once he was gone. Evelyn's cheeks flushed with shame, her lips parting but no words emerging. Daniel bent slowly, gathering the spilled grain with shaking hands. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Morris. I'm only a guest here." Her throat tightened. "Daniel, it's not." He rose, meeting her eyes. The pain in his gaze was not fiery rage, but something worse, quiet disappointment, a reflection of all the times he had been told he was not enough. "I'll find work elsewhere," he said softly. "You needn't trouble yourself with me." He left the room, retreating to the small chamber she had given him. Evelyn sank into a chair, tears pricking her eyes. She had not gone further than stolen touches, but the betrayal was real, and the cost of it threatened to drive away the one man who had treated her with dignity. By morning, gossip had reached every corner of Fairbrook. Clara Whitfield, ever eager to scorn, remarked loudly at the mercantile, "Imagine choosing a husband so thin he can't even hold his wife's attention." Pitiful. Laughter followed, and Daniel, overhearing from across the aisle, felt the words slice into him like knives. That night, he sat on the porch of Evelyn's farmhouse, staring out at the dark fields. The ache in his chest was familiar, the ache of rejection, of never measuring up. Yet this wound cut deeper, for it came from a woman whose kindness had felt like salvation. Inside, Evelyn watched him through the window. She saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way he stared at the horizon as though searching for a place to belong beyond her. Guilt crushed her, heavier than grief, heavier than loneliness. Nate had stirred her body, but Daniel had touched something far greater, her soul. She pressed a hand to her chest, a silent vow forming. She could not let her mistake define her. She would have to prove, somehow, that her heart belonged not to fleeting passion, but to the quiet, steadfast man who had come to her with nothing yet offered everything. The choice lay before her, stark and unforgiving. And if she hesitated, she feared she might lose Daniel forever. Redemption. The farmhouse was hushed, yet the silence between them carried more weight than any storm. Daniel had spoken little since witnessing Evelyn with Nate, and the distance he kept was colder than words of anger could have been. Evelyn felt that silence in her bones. Each day, she watched him labor with quiet devotion, and each evening he withdrew, retreating to his small chamber as though the walls might shield him from further disappointment. She could not endure it any longer. One evening, as the last light faded and crickets began their song, Evelyn stepped onto the porch where Daniel sat sharpening an old axe. His hands were steady, but his eyes were fixed on the blade with a focus born of hurt. "Daniel," she said softly. He paused, but did not look up. "Yes, ma'am." Her chest tightened. The distance of that word, "ma'am," felt like a chasm. "I owe you honesty," she began. "What happened with Nate was wrong. I let loneliness blind me. He offered me attention, and I was weak enough to take it, but it meant nothing compared to what you've given me." At last, Daniel raised his gaze. His eyes held no fury, only weary sorrow. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I came here a stranger. I'm still a stranger." "No," Evelyn whispered, stepping closer. "You're not a stranger. You're the only man who has treated me with respect since my husband died. You work without complaint. You listen without judgment. You care, Daniel, and I was a fool to risk losing that." He set the axe aside, his jaw tight. "But you did risk it. You chose him." Tears stung her eyes. She sank to the porch rail, her hands clasped. "I made a mistake, but I am choosing you now. Not because you stayed, not because of what the town whispers, but because you are the man I want by my side. If you walk away, I will deserve it, but I pray you won't." The confession hung between them, raw and unvarnished. Daniel's silence stretched, heavy with deliberation. For years he had carried the wound of rejection, branded as too weak, too thin, too insignificant. Evelyn's betrayal had reopened that wound, yet her words pressed against it like balm. She saw him, not as frail or unwanted, but as worthy of love. Still, the choice was his to make. The next day, fate forced the matter into the open. At the marketplace, Nate approached Evelyn with his usual swagger, loud enough for the town to hear. "Why cling to scraps?" he taunted, eyeing Daniel with contempt. "Come with me, Evelyn. I can give you strength, a real man's touch." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara Whitfield smirked from across the street, clearly relishing the spectacle. All eyes turned to Evelyn. Her cheeks burned, but this time she did not falter. She stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. "I don't want strength without honor," she declared. "I don't want a man whose promises are shallow. Daniel Carter is my choice. He is my husband in all but name, and I will stand with him, no matter what you or anyone else thinks." The crowd murmured, shock giving way to whispers of respect. Nate's grin faltered, his pride stung before so many witnesses. He muttered a curse and stalked away, leaving only the echo of his defeat. Daniel stood frozen, the words replaying in his mind. My choice. My husband. For the first time, someone had claimed him not as an obligation, but as a man worth standing beside. Later, when they returned to the farmhouse, Daniel stopped Evelyn at the door. His hand trembled as he touched hers, but his voice was firm. "If I stay, it cannot be half a life. No secrets, no doubts, only us together." Evelyn met his gaze with tears and relief. "Only us," she promised. In the quiet that followed, something shifted. The walls between them crumbled, replaced not by perfection, but by honesty. Daniel's heart, scarred by rejection, found healing in her courage. Evelyn's guilt gave way to redemption. Her love proven not by flawless loyalty, but by the strength to admit her failing and fight for what mattered. That night, they sat by the fire, not as landlady and guest, not as widow and outcast, but as two souls who had chosen each other against the judgment of the world. The future would not be easy. Work never was, but together they could face it. For Daniel, the shame of being too skinny no longer defined him. For Evelyn, the shadow of loneliness no longer consumed her. What bound them now was not appearance, nor convenience, nor fleeting passion, but the enduring power of love that forgives. And in that fragile but unbreakable bond, their story truly began.